Albie here from Spirit for Spirits, welcoming you back behind the stick. Today we're going to talk about Scotch whiskey. First things first, what makes Scotch Scotch? Well, it's whiskey that's bottled in Scotland. We went through some of what made whiskey whiskey. Check out some of our other episodes. One of my favorites on the left here, this company with this really huge, long, ridiculous name that I'm going to butcher as well. It's called Bruichladdich, right? So the Bruichladdich, or the Classic Laddie, as they like to call it, is a very old distillery that went defunct for a while and then was reopened. And when they reopened, they launched some really cool stuff people had not really done before. It is on an island in Scotland called Islay. Now, that particular island is famous for making super smoky whiskey, but we're going to get to that in just a second. The reason I brought this one here is that this Islay single malt Scotch is completely unpeated. Now, Albie, what does that mean? Peating is imparting of smoke into the grain during the malting process. We'll get into some of that in one of our episodes about distilling. Really, what we're talking about, peat smoke, you're talking about some of these big, super smoky, way super bold things that almost hide the imperfections of the grain. What they did at Bruichladdich, they made something that had no peat in it. There was no way to hide the grain. They aged this for 6 years in a used oak barrel, most probably a used American oak barrel, probably from bourbon. So you see it has this very light color to it as opposed to something darker, but we'll get to why that's dark in just a second. A little bit lighter and really, really lovely. Now this one happens to be an Islay barley from 2010. They grew all the barley right there on that island. So this will give you the real cool flavor profile of barley itself as a main ingredient in whiskey, which is things like hay and honey and straw and really light citrus notes on its nose, not to be hidden by any sort of peat smoke. The light smokiness that is imparted in this all comes from the barrel. And if we've studied bourbon, if you looked at some of those bourbon flavor profiles, you'll be able to draw some of those comparisons about what the barrel actually does to the grain and why the grain makes those things so different. The next thing we'll do is see another Islay malt, and this one, of course, is the Lagavulin 16, a different distillery there on Islay, but does it in a much more classic way with a heavy, heavy peat during the drying process of the malt. That instills so much smoke to the grain. You really have a super smoky, very bold cask here. The last thing you'll see on there is the age of 16 years, which means the youngest whiskey that's in this is 16 years old. So they have a huge breadth of product that they're blending into something really wonderful, super smoky, with behind it the flavors of those grays, that hay, honey, and straw. And when they say single malt, that means all the malt came from one place. The last thing we brought up here, this is a Glenlivet 12 double cask, which means that they aged it more than once, which is how they got this really dark, rich color. Now this one in particular has a light peating to it. So we have something heavily peated, something very lightly peated, and something completely unpeated. For your home bar, makes a really cool breadth of flavors that you can use for all different kinds of cocktails, drinking neat, different types of occasions. Now, the Americans have just started their own way of doing single malt, but that's another story. Next time, behind the stick.